One day I was with my mother at the grocery store. As we were in the checkout line, the total bill rang up, and my mother realized that she didn't have enough food stamps to pay for the groceries. I was probably 7 or 8 at the time, so old enough to feel ashamed that we didn't have enough money. But my mother was simply unfazed. She started taking some items out of the grocery bag, including, and I remember this so distinctly, a bunch of grapes. And she proceeded to tear off parts of the grape until the total bill fit what she had available in food stamps. This memory has remained a vivid life lesson for me. My mother, a poor immigrant, non-English speaking widow, was not powerless. In the face of life's ups and downs, she was resourceful and resolved. 1 week ago today, on Election Day, we opened a new chapter in our American conversation about inclusion and racial equity. And I don't know about you, but I am still working through my 7 stages of grief. 1, shock and disbelief. 2, denial. 3, anger. 4, bargaining. 5, guilt. 6, depression. And 7, acceptance and hope. Anyone in this room at number 7 yet? No? I didn't think so. 1 person. But in all seriousness, the topic of equity certainly carries more weight, a little more heaviness today than it did 8 days ago. And I have tremendous respect for Mayor Walsh, Dr. Atiya Martin, and the city of Boston for having identified racial inequality as one of your most pressing resilience challenges as part of the 100 Resilient Cities initiative. Given this, I was asked this morning to share with you some of the work that we are doing in Seattle that is centered on racial inequality. The examples I want to share this morning reflect how Seattle is incorporating equity in more meaningful ways into the fabric of our city government, and how we are honoring the inherent resilience of the communities, especially communities of color, that we are meant to serve. The relationship between equity and resilience, as we heard from Dr. Martin, is an important one. Leading with equity means that we recognize, value, and respect the resilience that communities of color and other historically marginalized communities possess. At the same time, the fact that communities of color have to be resilient often points to the absence of equity or equitable policies. So from a public policy perspective, we should never divorce the need to help communities build up their resilience from the need to dismantle institutional racism. But before I share some of the work that we are doing in Seattle, allow me to ground my remarks in a little bit of my own personal narrative, which informs my perspective on equity and resilience. So when Mayor Ed Murray appointed me as deputy mayor, I became the first Asian American woman to ever hold such a position in Seattle's history. My appointment was all the more noteworthy because while Asians make up less than 5% of the total U.S. population, in Seattle we make up 14% of the population, the largest racial group. My role is to promote meaningful relationships between the mayor's office and our city government and the diverse communities in Seattle, as well as to foster positive relations with our state, federal, and international partners. And this last component of my job has allowed me to travel to Amsterdam and Brussels, Daejeon, South Korea, Brisbane and Sydney in Australia, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Hangzhou, and Shanghai in the last 2.5 years alone. Quite a jet-setting schedule, but one very much removed from my family's humble roots. In 1980, my mother immigrated from South Korea to Seattle, a widow with little education and almost no English speaking skills, hardly $1 to her name, and 3 young daughters to take care of. Our father had suddenly passed away from cancer about 2 years before, and following his death, our once middle-class lifestyle had quickly evaporated as savings and financial help from extended family quickly dwindled. We faced growing housing instability for the roughly 2 years between my father's death and our immigration to the United States. At our lowest point, my mother, my 2 older sisters, and I called a small room behind a vacant storefront our home. Now, once in America, like many immigrants, the only job my mother could get was working in the service sector, where she worked every weeknight as a janitor on the graveyard shift. Every day when my sisters and I would come home from school, my mother would have dinner ready for us, even though she had to rush off to her job in downtown Seattle. Every morning when we got up from school or got ready for school, our mother would have breakfast ready for us, even though she'd only managed a few hours of sleep after coming home from a long night of work. My mother's immigration journey impressed upon me from an early age the challenges that immigrants, refugees, limited English speakers, people of color, and low-income people face in our country. And while my mother was grateful to have a job, she lived a fragile paycheck-to-paycheck existence, and her only hopes for prosperity and upward mobility rested with her daughters, never with herself. Fortunately for my sisters and me, education provided a path out of poverty. But our experiences are at risk of becoming ever more rare as intergenerational poverty deepens in the United States and as income inequality continues to grow at an alarming rate. This is a trend that we are seeing in Seattle, ironically accelerated by our region's incredible growth right now. A few weeks ago, a headline in the Seattle Times read, quote, "Seattle skyline is tops in construction cranes more than any other U.S. city," unquote. More cranes than New York and San Francisco combined, and in fact, Seattle's crane count, there is such a thing, a crane count, has grown 38% the past year, and there are no signs of letting up. These cranes are the physical manifestation of a population explosion and economic transformation of our city that hasn't been seen since the days of the Alaska Klondike gold rush in the early 1900s. Unemployment in Seattle has dipped below 4%, down to 3.9%. But this intense growth threatens to mask and in some cases exacerbate some deep-seated racial and economic inequities that persist in our society and our city. For instance, Seattle is fairly segregated in our housing and public education. Our city population is 70% white and 30% people of color, yet the majority of our students in our public education system are students of color. 36% of African American students do not graduate on time or at all, compared to a 24% average for all students. And while Seattle's median income is at an all-time high, now more than $80,000, people of color are more than twice as likely to live in poverty, 19% for people of color versus 9% for whites. And similarly, as I mentioned, while Seattle's unemployment rate is now below 4%, Black people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed, 14%. Again, these are some stark statistics that point to the threats that we face in Seattle in achieving equity and promoting resiliency. And despite Seattle's reputation, like Boston, as a liberal, progressive city, clearly we have our own work to do. Recognizing this, about 12 years ago, the city of Seattle launched a race and social justice initiative, I'll be using the acronym RSJI, in order to end institutionalized racism and race-based disparities in city government. Seattle was the first city in the nation to implement this kind of anti-racism initiative, and we remain a national leader in this growing movement. When he took office in January 2014, Mayor Ed Murray issued an executive order, one of his very first actions, reinforcing the city's commitment to RSJI and making racial equity a focal point of his administration in all aspects of city government. Now, over the decade, RSJI has expanded and been refined and adapted. And the two examples I want to share with you this morning quickly reflect the two recent iterations of how RSJI is evolving in Seattle. The first example involves the Seattle Design Commission. The Seattle Design Commission is an independent body that advises the mayor, city council, and city departments on design of capital improvements and policies that shape Seattle's public realm. The Seattle Design Commission generally reviews capital improvement projects at 3 stages. At concept, which is at 30% design, schematic 60% design, and at design development 90%. This year, the Commission put forward a new policy that outlines a process to consider equity in the design of all public spaces and public facilities. In their review of new buildings, landscapes, and related programming, the Commission wants to know that the city is addressing race and social justice impacts to all communities, and that the plans we develop include the input of historically marginalized groups. The process is actually pretty straightforward and not overly prescriptive, but it will now be an important part of how we are making public infrastructure investments in Seattle. City departments must be able to articulate what issues of equity will the project address? Who are the groups or individuals affected? How did city agencies engage with those groups? How is that engagement reflected in site selection, designs, landscape, or program? And how will ongoing city operations and programming be influenced by that engagement? We believe that incorporating these equity-driven questions in the design review process will result in greater intentionality in utilizing design and planning as critical tools to advance equity in our city. Another way in which Seattle is leading on equity is through our Equitable Development Initiative, EDI, announced by Mayor Murray just last month. Social equity has been one of the core values guiding Seattle's comprehensive plan since 2009. But this past year, the city conducted a growth and equity analysis designed to help identify potential future displacement impacts on marginalized populations and strategies for mitigating those impacts. This growth and equity analysis was incorporated into our 20-year comp plan called Seattle 2035, and for the first time, we have mapped out neighborhoods at high or low risk of displacement and neighborhoods with high or low access to opportunity all across our city in order to help inform what planning, economic development, housing, and other tools we should utilize to manage the city's projected growth of 70,000 new residents and 115,000 new jobs over the next 20 years. A quick aside here, by way of comparison with the 70,000 figure projected over the next 20 years, in the last 6 years alone, 90,000 new residents have come to call Seattle home, which really just highlights the incredible pace of growth that our city has experienced in less than, a little over half a decade. Like with the Seattle Design Commission, the Equitable Development Initiative provides a guiding framework to determine how resources are allocated and how public infrastructure and capital decisions meet equitable needs. I just have a few slides that I wanted to show you from the growth and equity analysis that was done. And all of this can be found on our city's website if you look at the Office of Planning and Community Development. This map shows, this is a map of Seattle, and long story short, the areas in red and deepest red are parts of the city that have seen the most significant decrease in population change for people of color. The areas in blue and darkest blue are the areas of increase. If you know anything about Seattle, geographically, we're obviously a very long city, north and south, and historically, we have had a divide in our city between the south end and the north end, and really, there's sort of this sort of pinch point that you can see in the geography of our city that really is represented by our Ship Canal Bridge that connects North Seattle to South Seattle. So if you look at this map and you look southeast in the Rainier Valley, that is, and as you can see, in the next few slides, you'll see that's where the concentrations of our communities of color continue to reside. Here, I think this is a vulnerability index that was conducted as part of this analysis, and the areas of orange, deep orange, reflect where there are neighborhoods that are most vulnerable, at most risk to not be able to withstand gentrification and displacement pressures as growth occurs. And again, as I mentioned earlier, those areas are again reflected much more concentrated in the south end of our city. This is a displacement risk index. Again, part of the considerations with the growth and equity analysis was taking a look at neighborhoods at highest risk for displacement of current residents. And then this is the access to opportunity index that again reflects where access to good schools, access to transit lines, access to other public amenities are highest. And the areas in sort of the teal color are the areas with greatest access to opportunity. And a similar theme here, the areas in sort of that orangey brown color, again reflected more in our south end, are the areas with lowest access to opportunity. And then finally, this is just sort of the culmination of all of those maps. These are not reflective of all of Seattle neighborhoods. We have about 122 identified neighborhoods in Seattle, but these represent sort of the main neighborhoods and kind of where they map out. The Equitable Development Initiative, really grounded in this growth and equity analysis, will also help move community-based development projects forward in areas with high risk of displacement of current residents or low access to economic opportunity. Through EDI, the city will provide staff support and financial resources for capacity building for community partners in those areas, starting with $200,000 allocated in the mayor's budget for 2017, and then ramping up to $600,000 per year thereafter. Additionally, Mayor Murray announced a special equitable development fund allocating a one-time $16 million investment to finance non-housing capital facility needs in community-driven projects in those areas. Our city funds will seek to leverage funding from other public and private as well as nonprofit sources. And what would such community-driven projects include? For the past 4 years, our planning department has been working with several projects that could fit the Equitable Development Fund criteria, such as shared spaces for small business projects or small-scale food manufacturing, cultural preservation and new pathways in the arts and creative industries rooted in Seattle's historic hub of the African American community, or an international market and cultural center in our Little Saigon business district, which is currently facing intense gentrification pressures. And to ensure the voices of our marginalized communities are heard, the Equitable Development Initiative is committed to work in strong partnership with the communities that it intends to serve. This is a critically important point. How many people here in this room have heard about a little musical called Hamilton? Anyone? Show of hands, come on, get them up there. A signature theme from the musical is the line, "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" Who tells your story? When we as policymakers and influencers think about either promoting or embedding equity and resilience, our decisions have to be also centered on this question: who tells your story? In the musical, this question is a poignant one in the telling of the narrative of a remarkable founding father whose life was tragically cut short and who history books have diminished in importance. The question is the very reason for the musical itself. Who tells your story? Similarly, when we talk about equitable development, we should consider who gets to tell the story of historically marginalized neighborhoods. Design and planning have critical roles to play in this storytelling. And with both the Seattle Design Commission's work that I described and the Equitable Development Initiative, we in Seattle are making space for many of these historically marginalized communities to tell their own story. Our new Director of Planning and Community Development, Sam Asefa, who is himself an immigrant from Ethiopia, has a long history of bringing marginalized voices into planning processes in cities all across the country, including San Francisco, Chicago, and Boulder. We are very excited for Director Asefa's leadership on this front as he and his department implement EDI over the next several years, so stay tuned. I started my remarks this morning by sharing my mother's journey to America. Let me close on that. 6 years after immigrating to the United States, 6 years after working the graveyard shift every weeknight as a janitor, my mother passed away from lung cancer. My oldest sister had just turned 18, my middle sister was 14, and I was 10. I wish I could say that I knew she passed away in peace, but I can only imagine the fear and despair my mother must have felt, consumed with worry about the fate of her 3 young daughters. I can only imagine, and yet my most persistent memories of my mother are ones where she shines with tenacity and resolve. Just as it was my mother's struggles that first shaped my commitment to equity, it was my mother who first taught me about resiliency. One day I was with my mother at the grocery store. As we were in the checkout line, the total bill rang up, and my mother realized that she didn't have enough food stamps to pay for the groceries. I was probably 7 or 8 at the time, so old enough to feel ashamed that we didn't have enough money. But my mother was simply unfazed. She started taking some items out of the grocery bag, including, and I remember this so distinctly, a bunch of grapes. And she proceeded to tear off parts of the grape until the total bill fit what she had available in food stamps. This memory has remained a vivid life lesson for me. My mother, a poor immigrant, non-English speaking widow, was not powerless. In the face of life's ups and downs, she was resourceful and resolved. I share my personal narrative and this anecdote with you this morning because when we talk about inequity, we must be grounded in the real life lived experiences of those we are aiming to serve and benefit. And we must see them as we see ourselves, as people who have resilience and who have every capability to tell our own story. Think about that line from Hamilton again. Who tells your story? We must be mindful of this question, or else we risk turning our attention and commitment to equity into fakequity. Yes, you heard me right, fakequity, as in fake equity. I first came across this term on a blog post written by a nonprofit and community leader in Southeast Seattle, a gentleman by the name of Vu Lee. His blog is called Nonprofit with Balls. And if any of you have a chance to look that up on your device, you should look it up because he is a very humorous and clever young man. But although Vu did not coin the term itself, he talked about it. He wrote about fakequity. And I'll just share a paragraph that he wrote. Quote, people seem to think that forming an equity committee, talking about equity, sending staff and board to trainings, listening to communities, conducting research and gathering data, and adding technologies to websites and brochures are sufficient to achieving equity. But no, these things are necessary, but not sufficient. When we just talk about equity and go no further, we are guilty of fakequity, unquote. As you embark on a very exciting new chapter in your city's commitment to eliminating racial inequality in Boston. I hope some of the work that we're doing in Seattle can be informative. Hopefully more lessons to emulate rather than lessons to avoid. But I am also confident that Seattle will soon be turning to Boston to take a few lessons from the recommendations that are due to your mayor soon. Clearly, no city in America has figured this out. But as we join in a growing community of like-minded cities through efforts like the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative, it is through our collective action and commitment that we can accelerate our learning and speed progress toward a more equitable city and nation. Thank you.
So I had a question about some of your initiatives you talked about, one of which was the Seattle Design Commission in terms of creating equitable guidelines for that commission. I was wondering if you had thoughts about how you could take that to a deeper level in terms of capital budgeting decisions and programming decisions in terms of capital projects, if you had thoughts on that.
I think it's a good thing. One of the things that is challenging, I think, for any city, any government, and that is, I think, particularly urgent as our population in the U.S. and especially in cities become more and more diverse, is the need for data disaggregation. And I think right now, I know I can speak for Seattle, we are doing it not so well. Just to give you an example, when I mentioned that Asian Americans and now as a separate racial group, Pacific Islanders are the largest racial group in the city of Seattle. That group, though, represents at least 47 different ethnicities that aggregating all of those individuals, all those populations into one group simply doesn't capture the complexity. We've got fourth and fifth generation Japanese and Chinese Americans as part of that Asian category, but we also have first generation or immigrant generation Cambodian and Vietnamese immigrants who have very, very different health disparities, educational attainment levels, and so on. And so I think that for any city, and especially as for cities that are continuing to see demographic trends toward greater and greater diversity, I think digging deeper into the data is important, and disaggregating the data is important. I think that in the city of Seattle, one of the ways, and I mentioned this to a few folks I had dinner with last night, we are actually, I mentioned earlier, our director of the Office of Planning and Community Development, Sam Asefa. He has been on the job 6 months in a department that has only been in formation for the past year. And what that Office of Planning and Community Development represents for our city is our mayor's commitment to better integrated long-term planning for our city across especially our infrastructure departments. And so as part of his new duties, Director Sam Asefa is actually co-chairing a capital sub-cabinet or a capital cabinet among our city department directors. Through that capital cabinet, the idea is to bring, Department of Transportation, our Public Utilities Department, our City Light Department, all together in one room, and to be able to have conversations about the complexities of infrastructure projects, the capital planning work that they are doing, to integrate that and lead with and kind of overlay on top of that the issues of equity that we're exploring through our Equitable Development Initiative.
I was very intrigued by the Opportunity Displacement Index, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about what were the indices that you were tracking, but also what would be early indicators of reducing or reduced displacement pressure or increased opportunity.
I think it's very exciting that we did this growth and equity analysis from the perspective of many of the community partners. As Katie mentioned, in my prior life, I worked as a community development affordable housing developer. And so many of the folks that are community partners are people that used to be my peers. And from their perspective, the kinds of anti-displacement strategies that the city now is thinking about instituting really are about 2 decades too late. And so there's real tension that we are experiencing in Seattle right now because we have a city government, myself included, that feels very positive about finally putting some of these strategies in place, recognizing the data, seeing how important it is to understand the data. But for communities, especially communities of color in our Central District and Southeast Seattle, the speed with which the mitigation strategies are being put into place is simply not fast enough. And so, things like the Equitable Development Fund, which will, provide the most significant investment in non-housing capital, community capital needs, is something that, quite frankly, a lot of our community partners are kind of shrugging their shoulders. They're happy about it, they're excited about it, but they're also saying, geez, it would have been great if, we would have had this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, because you know what? The land prices in Seattle are skyrocketing so much, I can't compete with double, triple the offer. So it's a real tension point that we have right now.
Thank you.
How much work is it reasonable to expect from people for them to have equal standing in a society? Does it make sense to have people working 40, 50 hours a week when we also expect them to be good citizens, to keep abreast of things that are happening in the news, to take care of their children?